people, talk about Bruce Lee, his life, or write about it, the subject of racism comes up. And usually when he lived in Hong Kong, that's one area they'll discuss it. And then when he came to the United States, when he turned 18 and lived in San Francisco briefly, and then Seattle, and then Oakland, and then when he came to Los Angeles in his film career. You hear a lot about it in race, and the issue of race, and how he felt about it or whether it existed in his film career. It is true when he was raised in Hong Kong that it was ruled by the British. And in 1898, they were granted a 99-year extension of their rulership of Hong Kong Island. And that must have been very difficult for the Chinese. There's no question about it. And I write about that in my book. And then, of course, this was worsened when World War II broke out and the Japanese occupied Hong Kong from 1941 to 1944. And there's stories about Bruce being on the rooftops waving his fists at the Japanese planes as they flew overhead. I don't know whether that's true, whether he did. He had to be, from 1 to 4 years old, and that's it makes for a great story anyway. But then when he left Hong Kong and he came to the United States, he stayed in San Francisco for a short time, and then he went to Seattle, where he moved into Ruby Chow's restaurant and lived upstairs in a small bedroom area and worked in the restaurant. And he was teaching Kung Fu. And it was during that time, he was also going to school at Edison High, and then he went on to the University of Washington. But during that time, what's important to note is that if he had any racial, any racism in him, animosity towards other races, you wouldn't know it no one reports that. His closest friends in Seattle at that time was Amy Sanbo and Lonnie Konecko, who were very good friends of his at the University of Washington. And they were Japanese. Also, Taki Kimura, who was Japanese. Linda and James DeMille were Caucasian, and Jesse Glover was black. All good friends, all close to him. And so he just went out with everybody. He hung out with everybody. He didn't have anybody that he had any hard feelings about, any race at all that I could tell, or anybody else I've ever read about. He also taught non-Chinese. It's well known. He taught them Kung Fu, and everyone was welcome if they had a sincere desire to learn, and Bruce felt that they were of good character. And so when he came to the United States, I don't see any indication of him having racism in his personal life, people he saw and so forth. I think where we start to see the subject of racism come into Bruce's life, at least through biographers and historians and so forth, is when he came to Los Angeles and broke into the television industry. And there were people who made the point that they felt that maybe Bruce felt that he was being held back from roles in television because he was Oriental, he was Asian. And I think that that's a reasonable argument that could be made historically. But I think that those who go down that path often miss the idea that the Hollywood film business is a business and always has been. They sell movie tickets. They have shareholders. The major studios back then, it was the old system, but when Bruce was around, these major studios, they have shareholders, they have stockholders. And they are based on selling movie tickets. And they'll sell tickets, they'll make movies to whoever they think will buy tickets. And it's the same way in other countries. In Japan, if you went to Japan in the 60s and 70s, they're big stars. Toshiro Mifune is a great example. He's a big star making samurai pictures. I think if you tried to take a Chuck Norris at that time and break him into Japanese television and film, even with subtitles, say that he could speak the language, he'd have a difficult time. And we know that he tried that when he after Bruce died. Chuck went to he tried to break into the Mandarin film circuit. He made a movie with Bruce, successfully, and he was well known to Asian audiences, but he couldn't get started. They weren't interested. So there's that element. Van Damme has done very well throughout Europe. And Chuck Norris came back here after his film with Bruce and so forth, and he got some breaks, and he's had a very successful career here. So I think there's that element that, yes, it's more difficult and there are fewer parts, but there's a reason for it. It boils down to a business. I don't think there's as much of a racial issue as, some people who make that argument kind of make that leap that it's being driven by racism, where I'm not sure that they're not missing the idea of it being a business. When Bruce lived in Seattle, he went practically every weekend to see the Japanese Shambara films, the old Mifune films, and even the earlier films, before Toshiro Mifune. Amy Sambo told me that what annoyed Bruce about Hollywood was that the producers seemed to want to throw all Asians into one category: Japanese, Chinese, Korean. As far as the Hollywood producers were concerned, they were all the same. It didn't matter. They would cast a Japanese and a Chinese role, a Chinese and a Japanese, and so forth, and that bothered Bruce. Of course, around that time, there were producers who were casting Caucasians in Asian roles. Probably one of the best examples is Madame Butterfly, which is all Japanese, and they were casting Caucasians in the role on stage and in film. In those roles, and then there was Andy Rooney around 1959, the film Breakfast at Tiffany's, Blake Edwards' big hit film, where he had Andy Rooney, who played the Japanese photographer, and he had the tan face and the taped back eyes, and trying to act as a Japanese. And then you have the Charlie Chan movies. You have the very early TV series Amos and Andy, where you had two Caucasians in blackface, playing both of the lead roles. Racial prejudice operates in a lot of different ways, and maybe on a person-to-person basis, sometimes racial prejudice isn't so obvious, and sometimes doesn't even exist. But Bruce felt that the opportunities were lacking in Hollywood. And for instance, he could play Kato, but he could never play the Green Hornet. And in the same way that Hollywood is a business that operates on money, it's also that same money that pays writers to write scripts and starring roles for actors of various races. It's the money that also pays for the training and the education and so forth. And so I think Bruce had a good point that it wasn't racism, it wasn't racial prejudice on a person-to-person basis, but it was operating in another way. It's sort of like the NFL back then, and still to some degree. You had all those African-American players on the field, on all these teams, but you had only one African-American head coach. The opportunity for Bruce in Hollywood for the roles, it wasn't there. And that was aside from any idea of racism, saying we're not going to cast you in the role because you're an Asian, you're an Oriental. We're not going to cast you because there aren't any roles. I've always been fascinated by following Bruce's film career. Uh, and when I look back over it, I can't help but to come away from it saying it happened exactly the way it was supposed to happen. Of course, as everyone knows, most people know, he got his first break when he came down to the Long Beach Internationals in 1964 and put on that legendary demonstration. And it was from that demonstration where there were a lot of celebrities in that audience. There were a lot of people from Hollywood there, and word filtered back to Bill Dozier, who was at that time producing The Green Hornet, which is a series that he wanted to do for television. And Bruce Lee went in and did a Hollywood screen test. And if you haven't seen that screen test, it's on YouTube, and you definitely want to go watch it because it's a phenomenal screen test, and you can clearly see a star in the making in that screen test. But and he got the role as Kato in The Green Hornet. But I don't think. Of course, that series was canceled after one season. It was up against Batman, and it had a difficult row to hoe. But I don't think that was a real good vehicle for Bruce. I mean, it got him introduced, and he did some publicity, and his name, and his was became more well known. And it certainly got him into SAG. It got him into the union, and that helped. But I don't think there was enough action in that film, at least the type of action that Bruce does. That show came on, was aired in a family hour, and they just weren't going to allow the type of violent action that he was capable of doing. That was, turned Enter the Dragon into such a phenomenal success. And so after that series was canceled, he did get work. He was in SAG, he could work, and he worked on, he got some roles on Ironside and Longstreet, Here Come the Brides, Marlowe. They were just basically bit parts, just brief appearances. The one job that he got that I don't understand is he was hired onto the Wrecking Crew, and it was made in 1968. He came on as a karate advisor. I don't understand why he didn't have an action role. I have a feeling that he got onto that picture through Joe Hymes, who at that time was married to Elkie Summer, who had a starring role in that picture. She was co-star of that picture, and she was a rising star. She made her mark in Blake Edwards' film Shot in the Dark. She played that wonderful Swedish maid that everybody fell in love with, myself included. And but there were martial artists who were employed on that picture, who had roles on that picture. Bill Ruasaki was one. Joe Louis was another. Ed Parker, Chuck Norris. Mike Stone played Dean Martin's double. And so I just don't understand why Bruce had such a minimal job on that picture. If anybody has the answer to that, I'd love to hear. You can put it in the comments on this video. I think he could have. I think that movie, it wasn't for television, it was a movie, could have been a great vehicle for Bruce to get him out of television and get him on the path of filmmaking. But maybe, as I said, it worked out the way it was supposed to. One project in the history of Bruce's television and film career we've heard about, the suggestion of racism, is the TV series Kung Fu. It's been said that it was originally his idea, that it was stolen from him, that he was supposed to star in the leading role. I don't know I don't know the details of all of that, but I do think personally, I think that would have been a mistake for him. I think it was a blessing that he was not cast in that role of that was given to David Carradine. The reason is the same problem that he had with the Green Hornet. That was a family hour show, and it wasn't a vehicle for the kind of violence, the degree of violence that Bruce Lee was capable of demonstrating. Carradine's role was a very ethereal, was very heady, and there were moments of kung fu that he had in there, but it wouldn't have been enough for Bruce to rise to the degree of stardom that he found in Enter the Dragon. I think that James Coburn was the person that strongly recommended to Bruce that he not pursue any work in television, in American television, and suggested that he go to Hong Kong and that he accept the offer that Raymond Chow had made for him to make those three B films, kung fu films, because Coburn knew that if you get stuck in television, in American television, it's very hard to make the leap into feature film. I know that I was hired. I wrote for William Shatner for a number of years, and I was hired at one point to get him out of television, to write feature films for him that would get him into feature film and out of television. He had been typecast as Captain Kirk on Star Trek, and it was killing him. He had a very hard time getting out of television. The reverse is true also. If you're in feature film and you're established in feature film, you never want to go backwards. Even if you've never been in television, you never want to go from feature film into television for your first time. Classic example is Julie Andrews, who never made any appearances in television at all, and she was talked into doing the Julie Andrews Hour. She swore she would never, ever do television, and she'd been offered a lot of TV, and it turned out that was not a good decision for her to do the Julie Andrews Hour. It was a great show. It took a lot of awards, but it got canceled, and it's just a cardinal rule. And James Coburn knew that, and he told Bruce, you've got to get out of television and do feature film. And the vehicle, if what's being offered to you right now is to make those films in Hong Kong, do them. And of course, Bruce went there and he made those first films with Raymond Chow, and they didn't air here in the United States much at all. I remember seeing a full page ad in either Variety or The Reporter that I think was a Chinese Connection or Fist of Fury maybe was going to be shown in one of the local theaters here. It was an off theater. It wasn't one of the big theaters. It was here for a weekend, I think, and then it was gone. But those films did record business throughout the Pacific Rim, and that was huge for Bruce. That put him on the map, that he could sell tickets in the Pacific Rim. And it was with that success that they went to Warner Brothers, and they said, here are the grosses, here are the ticket sales, and can you give this guy a shot? And Warner Brothers went for it, and they said, yeah, we'll give you a director, give you Robert Klaus, and we'll give you Paul Heller, to come in and produce. And Bruce Lee went in and made Enter the Dragon, and that film to date is the #1 box office film in martial arts film. Never been topped. Grossed over $1 billion. It's the gold standard to martial arts film. I think it will always be the gold standard. And Bruce Lee did in that vehicle along that journey, he did with kung fu films exactly what Clint Eastwood did when he got out of television in Rawhide and those other bit parts he was doing in television, and went to Europe and made those spaghetti westerns. It's exactly the same formula, and I believe Bruce Lee would have had the same career that Eastwood had. I think that he would have had one or two, a handful of action pictures, and then he would have become a multi-million-dollar director. I said that in another video, but I think it's true. I think that Bruce's calling in Hollywood was exactly what it was the road that Clint Eastwood took. He would have been a multi-million-dollar A-list director that went to John Woo, but I think Bruce Lee would have had that. He that was his destiny, in my opinion, and he was well on his way to it. And he certainly had a huge hit with Enter the Dragon, and it opened the doors to Hollywood. He had a huge career in front of him, and I think that his career to get into Hollywood and open that door to him happened exactly the way it was supposed to happen. To expand on this subject of racial prejudice, it's interesting to me that, and others, that Bruce's first films, The Big Boss and Fist of Fury, which were also known as The Chinese Connection, had very anti-Japanese storylines. And in some scenes, it's had outright racial slurs towards the Japanese. And they did extremely well in Hong Kong and elsewhere, but they, of course, weren't shown in Japan. And Enter the Dragon, which was arguably Bruce Lee's best film ever in quality and everything about it, did not do well in Hong Kong. Why? Because Han, who was the ultimate evil, he was the villain in the picture. And the Hong Kong audiences, the Chinese, weren't interested in watching that. None of Bruce's films were ever released in Japan except for Enter the Dragon, where it surprisingly did really great box office. And if you look at Way of the Dragon, which was not released and wouldn't have been released in the United States, although it was released after he died, it was re-edited. It broke all box office records in Hong Kong. And why? Because he beat up a lot of white guys, a lot of Caucasians. And I think that this fluctuating regional box office suggests that the minute that you westernize Bruce Lee, he was no longer did that well in Hong Kong, to the Chinese audiences, but he did very well in a place like Japan. So, there's something to be said about. I think it's an interesting thought about racial prejudice as it pertains to the box office and the regional audiences. And you can see this in his films. I pointed out earlier that John Wayne wasn't able to go to Japan and demand a starring role in a samurai picture. And that was because he was a Caucasian American. And but I think from Bruce Lee's standpoint, it's important to point out that although Bruce Lee had an Oriental face, that he was born in the United States and spent the majority of his adult life in the United States in America. So even though he had an Oriental face, doesn't necessarily make him an Oriental, because he was an American, like John Wayne. And that's an important difference that often when talking about being left out of films in Hollywood isn't really pointed out. John Wayne going to Japan is not the same thing as Bruce Lee looking for work in Hollywood, because Bruce Lee was like John Wayne, he was an American. And I think that's an important point. That's an important distinction.